Hi, my name is Stephanie, and today we're going to be talking about research. So the first thing to talk about when we're thinking about research is why do it? Maybe you've been given an evidence packet already. Maybe you feel like you don't need to do your own original research. You already have positions that you can use. But doing original research is incredibly important for a number of key reasons. The first is because it allows you to develop more depth on positions you were already given. And this is maybe something that debaters don't think about that much. They think of research as only a way to write new positions. But you can actually make those already given positions much stronger if you come up with better evidence or more evidence to prove more nuanced points or additional advantages in the positions you were already given. The second thing is it allows you to surprise people with newer arguments. If there are the standard arguments that everybody's been using in every round, one, you might get pretty sick of it, and second, you'll know that your opponents are going to have a lot of answers prepared because they're used to hearing those positions. This is pretty self-explanatory, but if you write your own positions, do research, come up with new arguments, then you'll be able to surprise your opponents and you'll have a stronger position that's harder to defeat. And the third reason, which I personally think is the most important for why it's good to do original research, is because it helps you develop really good research skills. For myself, coming to college out of high school, I felt like I had a really solid grounding in the type of research that's required for academics, that's required for college, for writing papers, and for doing the type of works that universities require of you. And I learned it all through debate, because debate helps you synthesize academic articles, really look through search engines and know how to find the things that are going to be applicable to what you're trying to learn about. And it teaches you really important skills that are actually incredibly useful, both in academics and beyond. So, hopefully you're adequately convinced that it's important to do your own original research, so now let's talk about how to do that. The first thing that you need to learn is what types of things do you need evidence for? And in policy debate, the answer is pretty much everything. It's a very evidence-focused type of debate, as I'm sure you're already aware. And so you'll want to have a piece of evidence for pretty much every claim that you're making, with certain exceptions. That being said, not all types of evidence are exactly the same, and depending on what you need the evidence for, that might mean there's a difference in what you're going to be looking at, whether you're looking at news articles or whether you're looking at academic studies or whether you're looking at philosophy. So there are different types of things that you need evidence for, and almost always you need evidence when you're making an empirical claim. When you're saying something not just about logic and about what likely would cause what, but about what actually happens in the real world. And there are different types of empirical claims. So one type of empirical claim that you might be talking about is something about a specific state of affairs, about a specific thing that's going on in the real world. This is going to be the type of thing that you're going to be arguing a lot of the case in plans and in disadvantages and in counterplans and in types of positions that talk about a specific situation in the real world and what is going on about it and what's going to cause what in that situation. And in those cases, you probably want to look at news articles. You probably want to look at things like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, sources that are going to tell you current events and things that are happening now in the real world. And if you want to get a little bit more academic and nerdy about it, you can look at more advanced or more academic types of news articles like The Economist. But that's the sort of thing that you use when you're talking about a specific situation. Sometimes, instead of talking about one specific situation, you want to prove a general principle. You want to prove that one thing usually leads to another. And then instead of looking at news articles, you want to look at more academic economic papers. Those are the types of things that will tell you when you have a certain policy action that you take, generally speaking, it usually produces a certain result or doesn't produce a certain result. And so these are the things you're going to want to look through academic literature more for, and we're going to talk more in a minute about how to find these types of articles, because they're a little bit more difficult to locate well. Sometimes you want to prove a general principle, not just about economics or political science, what's going to cause what, but about something scientific. Maybe you're making an article about global warming, and you want to argue what's going to cause what effect in the atmosphere, or in the world, or in terms of environmental impacts. And then you might want to look at more scientific literature. And finally, sometimes you're proving more of a philosophical principle. This is the sort of thing that you don't always need evidence for, but usually do. And then you might be looking at philosophical thinkers, and that's also an academic article, but it's slightly different. That's not something you use as often, but it's also something to be aware of. Sometimes you're trying to prove a moral principle, and so you want to look at more philosophical thinkers. That's what's going to happen a lot more in critiques and in more critical literature. You're going to be looking at philosophical thinkers instead of economic or political science. It's about the academic discipline that you're looking at. But basically, the main division to be aware of is when you're going to need a news article versus when you're going to need an academic article, because that will help determine your process of where you're going to be looking for these types of evidence. So that brings me to my next point, which is how to find good evidence, where to look, how to do your research. And most of the time, you're going to be using the internet. And most of the time, honestly, you're going to be using Google. People might tell you that there are other search engines that are better, or you should look directly at the source. But in my opinion, the most effective way of finding good evidence is using Google because they have the best search algorithm. And there are two different ways you're going to use Google. One is when you're finding news articles, and one is when you're finding academic articles. So let's talk about the first one first. For news articles, you could use Google News. You could just use a regular Google search engine, but an important thing to be aware of is there are a lot of newspapers out there, and you want to be careful that you're using a reliable source. So there are a couple of ways you can do this. One is if you search in Google and you can restrict your search to certain websites. So you can restrict your search within Google to only articles that are in the New York Times or only articles that are in the Boston Globe. And that way you can use Google's search algorithms because you can't really search on the New York Times website, but it will only give you reputable articles. The other option is to just do a generic Google search, but just be aware as you're doing a search that you have to look at your sources and make sure that things are reliable. If you haven't heard of a newspaper, that doesn't mean you can't use it, but do a little looking around on their website. It should become pretty clear to you whether it is a reliable source or not. The harder thing to do is to find academic articles. Google Scholar is the way you want to go about doing this. Google Scholar is Google's academic search engine. It will only return results that are from academic sources. This is great because unlike Google News or general Google search, you don't have to do that type of refining where you have to look and make sure it's a reputable source. Almost entirely anything that makes its way into Google Scholar is going to come from an authoritative figure, and it's going to come from a reliable source. Google Scholar will give you some results that you won't necessarily always have access to, right? Sometimes it'll turn up results that are from academic databases that you need a password, you need an account to access. So you have to be careful about that. A good helpful rule of thumb is if it says that there's a PDF available, then that often means that you're more likely to have access to that article. You can also make sure that you can get access to certain things by getting a Boston Public Library card. A Boston Public Library card will actually give you access to a lot of resources so that you can better access the types of databases that you'll want to be looking at. A lot of these articles are going to be on databases such as JSTOR, LexisNexis. These are things that you'll come to recognize, terms you'll come to be familiar with, because you'll realize that you're going to be finding a lot of reliable articles in these databases. So then when you're doing this search, you have to be careful about the search terms that you want to enter. It's really important that you don't just type in a question that you're trying to find an answer to, because the algorithm doesn't work in such a way that if you type in the question, what are the effects of economic sanctions, it's going to yield the answer to that right away. You might want to instead take out the types of question terms like what and or, and the types of things that aren't as helpful in a Google search, and just say economic sanctions impacts or ocean exploration impacts. These types of expressions are going to yield you articles that are going to be helpful and that will actually yield these answers. Impacts, effects, outcomes, results, these are all terms that you might want to search in conjunction with whatever thing you're trying to find the results of. You can also just search terms that are going for background information, right? If you want to learn more about a certain conflict that's going on or want to learn more about a certain program that the government is using, just a simple Google search for that term will often be very effective. It takes practice, but another thing that's really important is getting used to looking at scanning through the article titles very quickly to figure out what's going to be useful and what's not going to be useful. Another thing with entering search terms is you want to be careful to use things that are actually in academic literature and not just debate jargon, right? It is not helpful if you search things like advantages and disadvantages in the same way it's helpful in debate because those are terms that everybody knows. In the literature, often they'll look at terms such as impacts and effects instead. and stuff like that. You want to focus on what is going to turn up results in the article itself as opposed to what is going to be the most applicable to debate. And the more familiar you become with reading academic articles, the easier this is. So now let's talk about actually reading the articles that you find. Academic articles can tend to be very dense. It's hard to sift through them, but once you get more familiar with them, it actually becomes not that difficult. One thing to note is that introductions and conclusions are usually very, very helpful. Unlike in a novel or in even a news article, they don't say the end result immediately in the first paragraph, right? They don't summarize the whole book in the first paragraph. But academic articles, they often do. The introduction or the abstract even, which you can usually get access to before you are even before you have to pay for the article itself, can tell you that how they set up their experiment, how they set up their analysis, and what they found right from the outset. So you don't even have to worry about reading through everything. You can read the introduction or the abstract and know whether that's going to be a helpful article right away. It also helps summarize things. Another thing that is important to note is that you're going to have to look through an article and find cards, right? You're not citing the entire article, you're citing a certain paragraph from it. So it's helpful to be able to look through things and find the types of articles that are going to yield you good cards. And usually these are the types of articles that are more well organized and are broken into sections with topic headings and with strong topic sentences that are the same types of things as the claims that you want to be making in a debate when you have claims, warrants, and impacts to your arguments. So you want to look through articles and find ones that are organized more helpfully, and that will help show you the ones that are going to be able to give you clear paragraphs that you can take actual evidence from.